So my name is Rachael Tucker. I'm currently Chief Data and Growth Officer for a company called Macrobond. And Macrobond is a macroeconomic data and software business that really specializes in collecting a bunch of macroeconomic data, but also streamlining the research process and getting people out of Excel and into a more streamlined analytic workflow where they can share that data across to their different constituents. So it's a pretty cool business. I came to Macrobond because I worked for a very long time at Moody's Corporation, which is a publicly traded business, in a variety of roles there. And one of the roles that I was in was the research business and really thinking about, how do you monetize the research from the credit rating agency, but also working closely with that team to think about how they produce that research content. And Macrobond stood out to me when I was looking at different companies as a really interesting combination of that data business as well as the software that enables the research. Another role that I had at Moody's is I was effectively the chief operating officer for a company called Bureau van Dijk, which is a private company data business that got its start in Europe, but is definitely a big global business now and really a core part of Moody's analytics offerings these days. If you think about the role of data in any growth business, I think of it in two ways, right? You have your internal operational data, and then you have what data you might provide out to your customers. And I'm really thinking about companies like a Macrobond, like a Sourcescrub, that have a very large proprietary data set within their business. I think first looking at those types of businesses and thinking about, what is your competitive edge. There's a lot of talk about, large language models and AI, and those tools have been around for a very long time. And so one of the things to think about is what is your competitive moat? What really makes you unique? And continually asking the question of where could I be displaced, from AI and other competitors. And what I've found in my experience in working with a variety of data and analytics businesses is for years, people have been talking about, this ability to automate and scrape data off the websites, et cetera, et cetera. But when you really get down to domain areas like, private company data, like macroeconomic information, there is an element of domain expertise that you really need in order to make those automation tools work. So they work at the 30,000 foot level. It's really great if I want to, edit a note to my customer, or I want to draft a note, for my team. But when you really need to get into the details and you need the level of quality that you need in order to really make decisions as a business owner, then, that human in the loop is vitally important. And I think it's really recognizing that. I think the other facet of it is from an internal decision-making perspective. And, here where I found a lot of challenges is if you're good at the first, right, you're really great at collecting the data, organizing the data as a business, that you tend to also collect and organize a lot of operational data. And so it's almost the reverse there, that you can get in your own way because you have so much data that you really lose track of what really matters for you and your business. And so one of the things that, we've talked a lot about at Macrobond is really making sure, what's the data that matters? What are the questions that we really need to answer in order to best address the needs of our market and our customers? And then, how do we make sure we have that available rather than starting with, well, what's the data we have? And therefore, what questions could we answer from that? Right. And I think that's a distinction between how you look at data kind of externally for your customers versus internally for you as a business. I think data goes through phases, right? There are different kind of fads that happen with data, different areas of focus depending on what's going on in the world. So you think 5 years ago, right? April of 2020, and that was right in the height of COVID. There were a lot of concerns about supply chain. There was a lot of concerns about, health risks, travel, et cetera. Now you have another crisis, but it's really trade and tariff driven, right? And so the trends of that data, I think, change over time, depend on what's happening kind of geopolitically and geographically. But the big theme I would extract out of all of that is that this increasingly interconnected world and increasing availability of data is really what's changed over time. And people recognize that it's not good enough to just look at from a supply chain perspective, who are you doing business with and what is their credit risk as an example. You also need to look at their supply chain. You need to look at the geopolitical risk of the locations where they are, the climate risk, and the weather risk of where they're located. So just this recognition of the interconnectivity of the information that we have, and the different things that are driving risk and opportunity within the businesses today. I think one problem to be solved is intellectual property, right? So Google's done a great job with, Gemini, you've got ChatGPT, you have all those big vendors now who've developed these very large language models that have basically taken everything that they could find off the internet that was ever written or created and created these like big models. I think now a lot of information providers and content, providers like a Moody's, like a Macrobond, like a Sourcescrub, like a lot of other companies are really thinking about how do you protect your IP. And so I think there's been a bit of a barrier at this moment because people are really trying to figure out how to take advantage of that new technology without giving away what's really like high value content. And I mentioned earlier that expertise that those individual data providers bring to the context of that content. And to the information that they're collecting. I think the other challenge is, being able to answer the question of, is this a good response or is this good information? And so even doing things like you see these, help bots, I think are a good way that people are starting to bring that information in. But how do you assess what a good response is? And how do you make sure that it doesn't just become generic, right? If everybody's using the same types of models in the same way, it's all going to start to kind of sound the same. And even now, I don't know if I could feel it, but I hear, other friends and colleagues who've said, oh, I know that was written by ChatGPT. There's just this tone and formality that comes out of some of these models that, over time, I think it makes us dumber as a society, to be frank. And I think that's a real risk for us of, who's going to be identifying those next areas of opportunity and, getting that detailed expertise that you really need in order to really understand and provide context around the data that you're providing. A lot of companies I've seen and worked with over time, they think, oh, I've got this data set. Well, this other group could use it within the business, but it's a completely different sales motion. It's a completely different kind of context that you need to put that data into that kind of renders it less valuable in that market and harder to really go after, even if you have the core data. And so I'd say that's what people are getting wrong, is that assumption of, hey, anybody could use this. But I think what people are starting to get right and righter is this idea of partnership, right? And not thinking that you have to be the one data provider, that by partnering with other related vendors who might be in adjacent spaces is a competitive threat, but really an opportunity. So really being able to knit together, what do you do well? And then where are those partners that that you can, sell through, sell to, combine the data with in a new way that really gives you opportunity to sell into new markets. So as an example, Macrobond has a well-established relationship with Bloomberg, right? Macrobond is really good at timely, accurate macroeconomic data and tools to analyze that data on a time series basis. Well, Bloomberg has a lot of data about individual securities, about indexes, about market volatility that you can bring into Macrobond's platform, as well as vice versa. So I think that's a really good example of how we've been able to extend our market reach by having those partnerships in place. I think that's a big assumption, assuming everybody has access to the same data. And again, I go back to my point earlier, which is I think we're still a long time before we really have access to the same data, right? It kind of, people might say, oh, it's the same data because, it's a list of companies, but you don't necessarily have the know-how in order to understand and assess what does it mean for those companies? What's the related information for those companies that you really need to start to pull together? So there's some level of just domain expertise that I think we still need as a society and in looking at the data. And I think computers will evolve towards that, but I think they're only going to evolve so far and so fast, at least in our lifetimes. And so I do think that competitive advantage is kind of sticking to your guns and thinking about, right, what is that unique data set that you can continue to capture and aggregate? And then also, how do you use and apply that data and really understanding, what are the tools that you could provide to your customers in order to access that information, right? Be it analytic models that you can help them with, be it software that helps them um, use that content more efficiently and effectively. I think there are a variety of ways that you can add value in addition to the content itself. Large language models are not a competitive differentiator. It's like having search on your website, right? So there is more that we've been able to do since we help people find the data through search, right? There's still more questions to be answered, more information to be gathered. Once you solve one problem as a business, there's always new problems that get unearthed by that, right? That you give them the occupancy information for the building, and then they want to know, well, what does that mean for air conditioner usage, or what does that mean for food supply? And so the more data you have, it's like this flywheel of more data that you need in order to feed that beast and to answer those questions. I think people will be surprised by how much they still need people to do work and how there'll be a lot that AI will displace, but it doesn't take away from the need for individuals and humans to actually do a lot of the core work and to really bring that expert judgment into the business. It might change, but even some of the things, even if you can automate them, you still need kind of people who understand foundationally how it works and how it all comes together, and to be able to be there when the machines break, right? And so really thinking about that and how you develop your staff now and how you develop your teams, not necessarily thinking it's all going to go away, but how do you make sure you've got that kind of human backup for when the computers fail?